Hi, welcome back to my channel. Now, many years ago, the British film critic David Thompson, in his biographical dictionary of film, laid out the classic movie lover's fantasy. You're on this boat, which contains every film ever made, and suddenly the boat starts to sink. You see a desert island across the waves from you, so you get a raft together, and before the ship sinks, you've got a chance to get 10 films, one each by the great directors of all time. One Ozu, one Rossellini, one Murnau, one Offals, and you get them on your raft. And as he's paddling away on the raft, David Thompson says, but hang on a second, I want to go back and I want to rescue every single film made by Howard Hawks. I want Bringing Up Baby, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, The Big Sleep, the whole works. I can't be without Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks is his 11th director. That director that is special to him, has a personal meaning for him, and he likes every single film that director has ever made. Well, my 11th director is David Cronenberg. I discovered David Cronenberg when I was about 12, 13 years old. I saw the film Videodrome. It blew my head off. I was in the company of a director, a sensibility, an artistic sensibility that I'd never come across before, who was making films about ideas about biology and transcendence that had never occurred to me. And I was fascinated, to the point where I almost felt that the films were kind of operating on me. You know how Videodrome is about films that are actually changing your mind and biology as you watch them. I felt that about Cronenberg's movies. And of course it helped that they were on VHS, those big chunky black VHS things that you put into the that top loader thing. And it sort of went with the film, and you got those little bits of static across the image, and that made you feel it was sort of changing you somehow. So I got really obsessed with his films, and I ended up writing my dissertation on Cronenberg when I did my film studies degree. So he's a director who is very, very deep in my psyche. Every single film of his means something to me. He's the only director who I have every single one of his films on DVD or Blu-ray. It's a sort of obsession. So he's my 11th director. So picking my favourite 10 films of his was very, very difficult. I have a very strong relationship with this director. So if your favourite film doesn't appear on this top 10, don't worry, I probably like it. We're going to begin with Existenz. Now, at the time, I thought this was the last of the great Cronenberg films. I've since revised that opinion a bit, but I still think that this marks the end of the great classic Cronenberg era. And what's interesting about Existenz, it's a bit of an anomaly in Cronenberg's work, because by this point he'd made about 10 or 11 films, I think, and yet it feels like the film of a first-time director. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's so fresh. It's so spontaneous and raw and young. It's so full of ideas and a bit crazy. And it's not afraid to go a bit loopy at the end. The sort of, it's a story about these guys who've created this kind of video game that you enter. It sort of plugs into your back and feeds straight into your synapses. And so your mind and your memory becomes part of the game. You live in this sort of virtual reality game. And this game has become corrupted by terrorists. So sort of halfway through this game that is being played by Jude Law and I forget her name, wonderful actress, Jennifer Jason Leigh, it starts to corrupt and it starts to go weird. And the narrative just goes all over the place. And you can tell that Cronenberg is having immense fun being as gory and as gross and as weird as he wants to be. And it just feels like the film of a first-time director just flexing his muscles in this new medium. And for this to come about halfway through his career is an exceptional achievement, I think. I love this film to pieces. I love the moment where Jude Law and Jennifer Jason Leigh just start having sex because it's what the game is telling them to do. That's the kind of thing that Cronenberg revels in, and I love it too. But let's go back then, for our 9th place, to Cronenberg's beginnings. These were the first films he cut his teeth on. Now, Transfer and From the Drain are 2 student films that are not really worth your time. But the next 2 films he made, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, definitely are worth your time, and I think are among Cronenberg's most underrated works. They're 2 sort of medium-length, sort of hour-long films that are sort of halfway between being a student film and being an independent feature. And why I recommend them and why I love them so much, this is Cronenberg at his purest. He's not making films for a wide audience. He's not making films for a studio. So he can basically do what the hell he likes. And here is the pure Cronenberg. Cronenberg in the raw, before he's been sort of refined. And I love it. The first film is a silent film where you're watching these young students who've been given telepathic ability, and they're in one of these wonderful modernist buildings that Cronenberg likes filming in. And it's like a scientific video, right? So all you've got is the voiceover of this scientist telling you the various stages of the experiment. And then you watch the actual events of the experiment, which don't always go along with what the scientist is telling you, kind of like an unreliable narrator thing. And the students start falling out with each other and destroying each other as they can't take the psychological connection. Crimes of the Future in colour is quite another work altogether. This is a polymorphously perverse film. It's a film set in the future where a disease has rid the world of all mature women. So all that's left behind is men and young girls. I'll leave it there. Not a film for the easily offended, but it was made in a time when cinema didn't care about barriers and thumbed their nose at them, and I think it was all the better for it. I miss those times when you could have a really, really close to the bone movie. It's great fun. I'll leave it for you to discover. At number 8, The Dead Zone. Now, The Dead Zone saw Cronenberg move to Hollywood. And he did what lots of people in Hollywood did in those days. He made a Stephen King adaptation. So you've got this director who's a very weirdy-beardy horror director, and he goes mainstream. Now, that might be cause for concern. In Cronenberg's case, you get a beautiful, popular work of art. Because Cronenberg, even though he adapts King and he doesn't undermine the novel in any way, right, but he brings his own sensibility to the work. And that's what makes this film so compelling, is that it's a very, accessible film about a man who, suddenly finds that he can start, when he touches people, he can see into their future. And one of the people he touches is someone who's going to be the next president. And this president, played by Martin Sheen, is a bit like Donald Trump. He's kind of like this crazy guy who's going to start a nuclear war. And so Walken feels compelled to stop him. An extraordinary performance by Christopher Walken. Even if you love Christopher Walken, if you've not seen this film, you've not seen his best performance. It's a really great performance. And it shows how good Cronenberg was with actors. He wasn't just a gore fest, weirdy-beardy art house, horror director. He really worked well with actors, and he works well with, emotional drama. And this is a very moving film. And it's filmed in this cold, grey, wintry world. And it's so impressive how Cronenberg maintains his own sensibility working in the world of Stephen King. I really deeply admire that. The music by Michael Kamen is gorgeous. And one of the other things I like about Cronenberg, he's often talked about as being the body horror king, right? It's all gore, it's all weird body parts going, all this sort of stuff. He's actually a deeply emotional director, and his films are very moving. And they're often in a very melancholy key. The music and the landscapes. There's a sadness in Cronenberg's films that I think often is not picked up on and not discussed. And this is one of his most moving films. It's really good. Talking of moving films, when I was a teenager, this movie, Deadringers, my number 7 choice, this was one of the movies that most affected me as a young person. It's actually based apparently on a true story about 2 twin gynecologists. Cronenberg read this story in a paper apparently, and they wanted to make a film of it. And in the film, the 2 twins, both played brilliantly by Jeremy Irons. Up to this point, as a teenager, I didn't take Jeremy Irons seriously as an actor. After seeing this, you couldn't help but take him seriously. It's an extraordinary performance. And again, it was another clue to me how good Cronenberg was with actors. But in the film, he meets this woman, played by Genevieve Bujold, who's got a trifurcate womb, right? She's got a sort of mutant womb. And one of the men becomes obsessed with her and starts falling in love with her. And that disturbs the relationship between the 2 twins, and that becomes the core of the drama. And slowly the 2 twins start to fall out and their whole world starts to fall apart. It's an incredibly beautiful drama, replete with Cronenberg's usual perversity. It has a surgeon scene where everyone's dressed in these kind of red devil capes with these horrible surgical instruments made of steel that look like sort of Inquisition torture instruments. But it's a very moving film, a very beautiful film with a gorgeous score by Howard Shore, who's one of the secret ingredients of Cronenberg's success, I think, as a director. It was a very moving film. It touched me and was one of my favourite films for many years. And it's still a great masterpiece, in my opinion. But at number 6, I've got to pick The Fly. Some people might raise their eyebrows at me picking this over Deadringers, but God, I love this movie. I will admit that one of the reasons I love this movie so much is the interplay between Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. Two actors I really enjoyed at that time, and they're at their best in this film. They're so good. And I think David Thompson wrote very well about this film, that it's a love story. It's not about a guy getting in a pod and being half transformed into a fly, though that bit's great. But it's really about the love story between a woman and a man who is changing and is trying to deal with this change in his metabolism and in his psychology. And it's very moving, again, it's a very sweet love story with loads of gore and baboons getting turned inside out. But and also men, turning into a fly and gobbing acid onto their food for it to be digestible. It's great fun. I love this film. Obviously, it's a remake of the original Fly with Vincent Price, modernised and actually made so much better. And it's a film that it plays with you. It's very funny, The Gina Davis-Jeff Goldblum relationship is almost a screwball comedy, but then it gets bleaker and nastier and gorier and more perverse. And I like that. Now, in 5th place, some people might be surprised that I'm going to rate this film so highly, is Cronenberg's first feature, Shivers. Now, this is often written off as a sexploitation horror picture. It's set in this block of flats, right? And these parasites that look like penises have got loose, and they're like little worms that go like that, and they crawl up your orifices. So, of course, you have a scene where a woman's in a bath and it crawls up her orifice, So a lot of people don't like this film. They think it's sexploitation. I must disagree. This is an important film. It may not be as good as some of the films I've already mentioned in filmic terms, but the reason I put it so high in this Cronenberg list is it's a very important movie in terms of the horror film. Every so often, a film comes along that is a landmark in the horror genre, like Murnau's Nosferatu, like Cat People by Jacques Tourneur, Rosemary's Baby by Roman Polanski, The Blair Witch Project. Because these are films that take horror in a completely new direction and give it a whole new flavour that we've never really seen before. That's what Shivers did in 1975. You'd had a lot of gore before, but body horror is something different. It's about disease. It's about disease as a new site of horror and of tension in horror and anxiety. And also it's about the way that Cronenberg explores it. This is not just an exploitation picture. It's actually a very, very well-made film. Take the opening credit sequence. I once wrote an essay about it. So how do you start a film of this kind? This is how Cronenberg starts it. He starts it with an advert for this block of flats where it's going to take place. A block of flats, incidentally, which is called the Starliner. Anyway, so he starts it off with a series of shots. So you get a gymnasium, a laundromat, a restaurant, a dentist surgery, in rather crappy little slides. Over the top of this, instead of some, bombastic, salesman music, you get this haunting, very cold, very melancholic music. And the voiceover is not some huckster guy saying, "Hey, come along, live in our flats." It's this guy going, "Hello, and welcome to the Starliner." That's my tummy speaking, which is very good for a Cronenberg video, isn't it? But, so he has this guy going, "Hello, welcome to the Starliner. You will find here that you go on a journey with us." It's this kind of low-key, very low-voiced. And that's the measure of Cronenberg as a great director. This, you're not being taken into a sexploitation picture. You're being taken into the picture of a director who knows exactly what he's doing and exactly how he's making you feel. Straight away, as you go in past that very melancholic sequence, you see a guy apparently trying to rape a schoolgirl who looks about 26. Then he pours acid on her. Yeah, it's that kind of movie. Then at the end of the movie, so there's this guy, this doctor and his nurse. They're trying desperately to get away from these parasites. And then Cronenberg plays his trick. They go into this gigantic swimming pool and everyone's been infected except him. And he films it like a sort of baptism, a sort of gospel baptism with everyone sort of in their arms and joyful. It's a wonderful occasion. And then you see them all going off 2 by 2 in their cars to infect the world. It's a Shakespearean comedy. Everyone's coupled up, and now we're going to go and make everyone else like us. Free love. Cronenberg is on the side of the disease. This was a whole new voice, a whole new sensibility in the horror film. And that's why this film, along with My Tummy, this film should be at number 5. In 4th place, now we're talking, Scanners. Yeah, I know you want me to talk about the exploding head, and I love it as much as you do. I still never tire of that scene. But there's so much more to talk about with Scanners. Now, what happened was, at the start of his career, Cronenberg made 3 sort of low-budget films to get himself into the business. And then soon after, about 5 years later, he went to Hollywood and he made The Dead Zone. In between is the sweet spot of Cronenberg. The 3 Cronenberg films, the trilogy that I think all Cronenberg fans really adore, and they're all in my top 4. This is the centerpiece of that trilogy, and it's an intriguing film. This is Cronenberg making a superhero film. Basically, it's the X-Men, a group of mutants who develop psychokinetic abilities and can also speak to each other telepathically. And two various companies, rival companies, are trying to get hold of these mutants, right? So it's pure X-Men. One of these companies is run by Patrick McGowan in a wonderfully dark and, grim performance. He's fantastic in it. There's a great anecdote that Cronenberg tells about making this movie. At one point, Patrick McGowan said to him, David, if I ever stopped drinking, I think I'd kill someone. And David Cronenberg said, well, keep drinking then. I love that. Of course, the making of this film, if you ever know about the behind-the-scenes story, my God, it was awful. I think on the first day of filming, there was a terrible car crash, which they were partly responsible for. And I think a guy got decapitated in front of the crew. It's one of those kind of cursed movies. And the whole movie is suffused with this really dark, tense, brooding atmosphere. It's not like any superhero film you've ever seen, from the Marvel Comics or DC universe. And I much prefer it, I must say. It's an absolutely fantastic film. It's not really Cronenberg's usual subject matter, but he brings to it all his usual little tricks, all the modernist buildings, those wonderfully 70s glass and steel buildings with terrible carpets, which I love, and all these wonderful names like Daryl Revok. I love all that stuff. This movie is just catnip for Cronenberg fans. In 3rd place, I've got the first part of this trilogy of films, The Brood. This is still, for me, one of the most upsetting and grim horror films. It's one of the very few horror films that still gets to me after seeing it many, many times, which is odd when you consider the rather bizarre subject matter. It's about, Oliver Reed runs this kind of clinic where he gets people to think about their interior pain and anxiety, and it comes out in their body. So it might come out in welts or an extra limb or different organs. And one of his patients is this woman, and her anxieties and her anger and her fears come out in the form of children. She grows this extra womb, and these tiny little sort of imps, these little dwarves come out of this womb, and they act her every whim. So if she doesn't like someone, they go and kill them. And so you have these kind of weird little dwarf creatures going around killing people. It should be ridiculous. It's actually one of the most horrible, queasy films ever made. And there's one scene where these little dwarves attack this teacher who her ex-husband is falling in love with. And they attack this teacher in this little primary school classroom, and all the kids are watching. They're clearly very distressed. It's really horrible, and it gets to you every time. Cronenberg made this in the wake of a very, very acrimonious divorce with his wife, and it shows. It's a very bitter film, but actually that bitterness gives it a strange power. And I think this film still to this day, it really gets to me. It's a striking film, very original, brilliant, and also just a little bit dangerous. In second place, I have to pick Crash. Partly because it's based on a J.G. Ballard novel, and I'm a great J.G. Ballard devotee. Partly because of the way I saw it when it first came out. Crash, you will remember, was banned by lots of cinemas across the UK because the Daily Mail did a sort of campaign against it. You know, that it was disgusting and perverse and horrible, which of course it is, but that's great. That's no reason to cancel a movie. And so it was still playing at the London Film Festival. And so I went with my Canadian friend, we dressed up, and we walked through these crowds who were campaigning against it, which I loved, and Cronenberg was there. And it was a great occasion, and I got very fond memories of that. I love the film. It's very difficult to adapt Ballard. One idiot in Sight and Sound said that Ben Wheatley's adaptation of High Rise was more Ballardian than this. He needs a lobotomy. This, I think, is a perfect example of cinematic adaptation, where it is pure 100% Ballard, and it is pure 100% Cronenberg. And how Cronenberg does that, I don't know, and it has my utmost admiration. It's a film about people who get a sexual kick out of car crashes. Yeah, well, I remember when I wrote about this film in my dissertation, I was talking about it to my girlfriend at the time, and she was absolutely horrified by it. I think she still is, actually. But it's such a wonderfully perverse film, but it's also, I think, kind of Cronenberg's purest film, where it's the purest, where he gets rid of narrative clutter. It's a pure investigation of this theme. So the film just opens with one sex scene after another, 3 sex scenes, boom, boom, boom. He gets rid of all the clutter, all the explanations, and it's a very pure film, looking at this sort of condition, this sexual condition as obsession. Cronenberg said about it in an interview that what he was interested in was that how in the late 20th century, sex was getting further and further away from its primary function of just creating babies. I mean, that actually is what sex is for. And it's becoming a leisure activity. And as it becomes a leisure activity, it connects with our more perverse, elements and what we're otherwise interested in to become something very different. And that's what Crash is about. I find this an endlessly fascinating film. Not for everybody, but I find it completely obsessional. But I have to go back to my beginnings from my number one. It is Videodrome, the film that first turned me on to Cronenberg at about 12, 13 years of age. And whenever I go back and watch it, I still fall in love with this movie. There are so many sequences and scenes in it that I absolutely love. For those who've never seen it, it's about a guy, brilliantly played by James Woods, who runs a porn station, and he's always in look for new porn, more hardcore porn. And one of the guys who works on the station says, "Have you seen Videodrome?" And it's this site which is showing snuff, sex, and violence. And Woods becomes obsessed with it, not realising that Videodrome has a signal in the video that starts to change you and affect you and turn you into the new flesh. So much to talk about. Brian Oblivion, the TV expert based on Marshall McLuhan, who will only appear on television on a television. I used to think that was hilarious when I was a teenager, and I still do. And James Woods finds that he's actually died, and that he only appears on television on videotapes that are kept in this huge library by his daughter. His daughter owns a mission where it's for the homeless, but they don't come in and get a cup of tea or a sausage or something. Instead, they come in to watch television. They're in all these booths watching television. And it has my favourite shot in any Cronenberg film, where James Wood looks over this partition, and there's this man just sitting there watching the TV like that, and he looks up. That's my favourite image in the whole of Cronenberg. James Woods grows a vagina in his midriff, and he pulls out of it a gun. Then he, this guy slots a video into that vagina to program him to do something. When he pulls out his hand, it's a hand grenade, and he blows up. I could talk about this movie all day. A television blows up, and all sorts of gizzards and colons and intestines come out. You have a scene where James Wood whips a television, and he's whipping this television, and then the television is pointed towards you so you can see what's on it, and it's his friend, and she's tied up, but she appears to be feeling the whip. Debbie Harry, her mouth appears on the whole of a TV screen, and then James Wood puts his head in the mouth, and the TV screen bulges around him. Just so original, inventive, fun, perverse. This is my cinema. I love it. So those are my top 10 Cronenbergs, but as I say, there's so many other great Cronenberg films I could talk about. I haven't mentioned Spider or Naked Lunch or Rabid. I haven't mentioned the most recent Crimes of the Future. I love this director. Let me know what are your favourite movies below. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe.